The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as Natalie Hayes pushed through the employee entrance at Seattle General, her badge catching the overhead glow. 0200 hours. Night shift. The kind of silence that only exists in hospitals after midnight, when the world above ground was sleeping and the fluorescent underworld belonged to people like her, people who moved through crisis with the muscle memory of someone who'd already survived worse. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, unremarkable. Her shoes were white nursing clogs that squeaked against the linoleum in a rhythm she'd learned to control years ago. Everything about her was designed to be invisible. Everything except her hands. Those hands, scarred across the knuckles, a thin white line running from her wrist to her elbow where shrapnel had caught her in Baghdad, those hands told a story. But nobody here was looking at her hands. Nobody here was looking at her at all. She clocked in at the main station, the time stamp reading 20:47 hours, and moved toward the night supervisor's desk with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her disappear into the machinery of the hospital. The ER at Seattle General in Raleigh smelled like antiseptic mixed with something older, fear, maybe, or the copper undertone of blood that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. The smell of a place where bodies came when they broke. Dr. Marcus Mercer was already at the physician station when she arrived, his tailored blue dress shirt catching the light like he'd dressed for somewhere more important than a night shift in the emergency room. He was reviewing charts, his $4,000 watch visible on his wrist, his jaw set in the expression of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered. He was 53 years old, according to the employee directory, had been the ER director for 8 years, and had never once made eye contact with a nurse that lasted longer than a command. What he didn't know was that Natalie had been studying the billing invoices for 6 weeks. She picked up the first chart from the holding area, a 67-year-old man with chest pain, and moved toward his bed. The chart itself was routine, admission form, vitals, preliminary EKG. But the billing section had something unusual, a listing for advanced imaging equipment that the hospital didn't own, charged at $847 per scan. She'd checked. The equipment list was public record. That particular scanner existed in exactly 0 departments at Seattle General. She moved through the ER bay like water finding its level. Bed 1, elderly woman with a twisted ankle, stable vitals, ice pack already applied. Bed 2, a teenager with appendicitis symptoms, pre-op workup in progress. Bed 3, empty. Bed 4, a patient post-cardiac stabilization, monitoring lines in place, chest rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm of his medication. Her eyes checked each vital sign monitor without stopping, her brain processing oxygen saturation, heart rate, blood pressure, the small story that every number told. 12 years of this. 12 years of reading bodies like battlefield maps. She had her daughter Emma's compass necklace hidden under her scrub top, the metal warm against her sternum. Silver, engraved with a quote Emma had insisted on, True North. She was 8 years old and brilliant in the way children were brilliant before the world taught them to be quiet. The night supervisor, a woman named Chen who'd been working ER for 21 years, handed her the medication cart as she passed. Night shift crew is minimal. We've got 3 beds staffed for now, but they're predicting a late-night admission dump. Drunk drivers, usually. Friday night protocol. Natalie nodded once, said nothing. She'd learned not to talk more than necessary. Talking meant being remembered. Being remembered meant questions. She was working through a routine for insertion on bed 2 when she heard the commotion at the entrance. Ambulance bay doors sliding open. Radio traffic crackling about a trauma incoming, ETA 8 minutes. A training accident. Fort Bragg personnel. That was enough to make the ER shift its weight like a living thing. The major arrived at 2,104 hours. They wheeled him in on a stretcher, his right shoulder bandaged but bleeding through the gauze, his eyes alert in a way that meant he was combat-trained and running on adrenaline. Tall. Military bearing even flat on his back. The kind of man who carried himself like he was used to being the most dangerous person in any room. Bed 6, Dr. Mercer called out from the physician station without looking up from his charts. He didn't move. Didn't check the patient. Didn't look at vitals. He just gestured with his pen like he was directing traffic. Natalie took the admission clipboard, read the intake sheet. Major Thomas Clayton. Special Forces. Fort Bragg. Training accident during knife insertion drill. Shoulder laceration with possible rotator cuff involvement. The handwriting was careful, military-trained, she could see it in the precision of the letters. She moved to bed 6 and began the initial assessment. Vitals first. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate elevated but steady, 84 beats per minute. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. His left eye tracked her movement with the intensity of someone trained to evaluate threats. "I'm going to clean the wound," she said, her voice careful and even. "Can you tell me what happened?" "Training exercise," he said. "Knife drill went wrong. Partner's fault, not mine." She didn't smile. She never smiled. But something in her face must have registered because his pupils dilated slightly, the way someone's eyes changed when they suddenly recognized a person they thought was dead. She moved the bandage back with latex-gloved hands, assessing the laceration. The wound was deep, clean, the kind of cut that came from a blade moving through tissue without hesitation. She could see the shoulder joint itself, the rotator cuff intact but compromised. Subclavian artery was visible and intact, a matter of millimeters and luck. If the knife had moved 3 inches inward, he would have died before the ambulance arrived. She began the debridement with practice movements. Saline solution. Sterile gauze. The removal of any debris or dead tissue from the wound edges. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from having done this before under conditions that were infinitely worse, in a forward surgical tent in Baghdad with mortar fire rattling the canvas, with the smell of diesel and blood and dust, with 3 other patients coding simultaneously and only her hands to save them. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until he whispered. "Baghdad forward surgical," he said quietly, his eyes locked on her face. "You're the medic who did the subclavian cut down on Captain Morrison under fire. I watched you through the smoke." The fluorescent lights hummed. The heart monitor behind her beeped its steady rhythm. Somewhere in the ER, a nurse was calling for supplies. The entire hospital continued moving around them in the normal dance of night shift chaos, and neither of them moved. She finished the debridement without changing her expression. One more saline rinse. One more assessment of the wound edges. Her hands steady as surgical lasers. She'd been trained to keep secrets so completely that her own face was a vault. "Your medication allergies," she said, not answering him, her voice the same controlled neutral tone she used with every patient. "Are you listed as NKDA?" His jaw tightened. He understood the refusal. She was not confirming anything. Not here. Not where anyone could hear. "No known drug allergies," he said, matching her tone exactly. But his eyes didn't look away from her. She applied the sterile dressing, gauze and surgical tape, wrapped with a kind of careful precision that meant it wouldn't slip, wouldn't come loose. She documented his vitals on the chart, noted the wound assessment, and then she turned to leave without another word. "Nurse," he called quietly, just as she reached the curtain. She stopped. Didn't turn around. "It's good to see you alive," he said. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze from the bed next to his. She took one measured breath. Then she walked back to the medication cart without acknowledging him, because acknowledging him meant confirming that Captain Natalie Hayes, officially listed as killed in action in Baghdad 8 years ago, her name erased from every database, her existence classified so completely that she'd become a ghost, was standing in the emergency room of Seattle General in Raleigh, North Carolina, working the night shift as a civilian nurse. That wasn't allowed. That was never supposed to happen. At the physician's station, she pulled the medication chart for bed 6 and began preparing the post-wound care antibiotics. Dr. Mercer was still reviewing patient files, his pen moving across the papers with a kind of focused intensity that meant he was looking at something. She glanced at the stack of charts in front of him, billing invoices, she realized. The same one she'd been studying. She watched him mark something with his pen. A charge for phantom consulting fees. $1,200 to a consulting group that didn't exist. She'd traced the company name. It was registered to a shell corporation. The shell corporation was registered to a medical supply company. The medical supply company had a director named Patricia Mercer, his ex-wife. The financial arrangement was beautiful in its simplicity. Inflate the charges. Split the overage. Repeat with enough patience that the per incident amount was small enough to avoid triggering audit red flags. She'd been documenting it all on her encrypted drive in her locker, behind the tampons and protein bars and a single folded flag, small enough to hide, precious enough to kill for, that was all she'd brought home from Baghdad. Dr. Mercer looked up and made eye contact with her for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for something to pass between them. Recognition, maybe. Not of who she was, but of the fact that she was looking at his charts. That she'd been reading them carefully. That she knew something. He smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. Then he turned back to his papers, and Natalie Hayes returned to the medication cart, her heartbeat steady in her chest, her hands perfectly calm, her military training doing exactly what it had been designed to do, keep her invisible, keep her alive, and keep the secret that the Pentagon had ordered her to carry for the rest of her life. The night shift continued its mechanical rhythm. Beds filled and emptied. Patients stabilized or deteriorated. And in bed 6, a Special Forces major watched a nurse he'd seen save 17 lives under enemy fire move through the ER like a ghost who was finally learning how to be alive, even if no one else would ever know her name. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came that afternoon. Dr. Mercer found her at the nurse's station with 4 residents clustered around the patient charts, his Harvard Medical School ring catching the fluorescent light like a weapon. He held up the Johnson family's file, flicking through pages with deliberate slowness, his voice cutting through the usual ER hum. Nurse Hayes. Did you actually question my antibiotic order in front of the Johnsons? You, with your community college nursing degree, second-guessing my training. The residents shifted their weight, sensing the blood in the water. His smile didn't reach his eyes, it was the smile of someone accustomed to winning. Let me guess. You read something on the internet and decided Harvard was wrong. Natalie kept her hands on the counter. Her voice came out level, steady as a held rifle. The patient has a documented penicillin allergy in the system. You ordered amoxicillin clavulanate. I was clarifying the chart. Clarifying. He laughed, a sharp sound like breaking glass. When I want input from someone who empties bedpans, I'll ask. Until then, stay in your lane, Florence Nightingale. The residents laughed nervously, not sure if they were allowed to, watching their attending's face for permission to think. One of them, a third-year named Chen, looked at his shoes. Another actually smiled. Natalie absorbed it all with one measured breath. She did not tremble. She did not retreat. She simply stood there, absorbing the isolation with the same composure that had kept her steady while mortar rounds fell outside a field surgical unit in Baghdad. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, not from hurt, but from the sheer absurdity of it, from years of carrying secrets while this man performed his authority like it was the only power he'd ever known. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Mercer's smirking face through the glass partition. Cruelty always costs more than the cruel expect to pay, she said quietly. Then she turned back to her patients. But that wasn't even the worst part. By lunch, red marker had appeared on the unit board in Dr. Mercer's precise handwriting, N. Hayes, insubordination, questioning physician orders in front of patients. Final warning. The letters were thick, deliberate, impossible to miss. A public execution written in felt-tip pen. Several nurses had already seen it. Natalie watched the break room go silent when she entered at 1,145 hours with her Tupperware container of rice and grilled chicken. Sarah, the new graduate nurse fresh from community college, the kind Mercer openly mocked, had been sitting at the far end of the table. She hesitated for 3 seconds, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth, watching to see if Natalie would sit near her. But then Mercer appeared in the break room doorway, not entering, just watching. He made eye contact with Sarah. A single look. That was all. Sarah grabbed her lunch bag and hurried out, mumbling something about checking her patients. One by one, they left. Janet with her coffee. Rodriguez with his sandwich. The two surgery nurses comparing notes. Even Miguel, who'd trained with Natalie for 3 years and always asked about Emma, gathered his things and drifted out like smoke. Within 90 seconds, she sat alone at a table built for 8, the empty chairs around her like a moat. Through the glass, Natalie watched Mercer in the hallway, talking to the charge nurse, pointing back at her. His network was already moving. She could see it in the way the charge nurse nodded, how her jaw tightened. A decision being made. An alliance being activated. The fluorescent lights above her hummed their mechanical song. Natalie ate her chicken, each bite deliberate, mechanically breaking down the protein because her body needed fuel. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained controlled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 20 minutes later, she was reassigned. No explanation, no conversation, just a printed sheet slipped under her locker door. N. Hayes reassigned to isolation wing, effective immediately. Dr. Mercer, MD. The isolation wing meant negative pressure rooms for the infectious cases. It meant being separated from the main ER floor. It meant being erased from the visible hospital, pushed to the margins where she couldn't ask questions about billing or dosages or anything else that might threaten a man with Harvard credentials and a network that stretched through the hospital like electrical wiring. It was institutional exile, accomplished without a single raised voice. When her shift ended at 2,300 hours, she approached her locker in the staff room. Someone had used a black marker to write snitch across the metal door. Just one word. Just enough to make sure she knew exactly what everyone thought she was. Natalie stood there for 30 seconds without moving, her hand raised to the combination lock, feeling something shift in her chest, not breaking, but settling. Like a jaw clenching. Like restraint becoming something harder. She opened the locker. The folded flag was still there, pressed between her spare scrubs and a pair of compression socks. The flag that had come back from Baghdad in a ceremonial box, the flag that had draped the casket of Sergeant James Holloway, her partner for 2 tours, the man who died covering her extraction. No one at Seattle General could ever know what that flag meant. No one could ever know it had been earned in blood, in smoke, in a forward surgical unit where 18-year-old privates learned what their bodies could endure. She touched it once, just to confirm it was real, then closed the locker. At home, Emma was already asleep. Natalie stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for 5 minutes, watching her breathe, watching her small chest rise and fall, safe in her bed with her stuffed rabbit and her nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. She had kept Emma safe by staying invisible. She had built a life of silence to protect her. And now that life was collapsing, one red marker sentence at a time. The next morning, Mercer stopped her in the hallway near radiology, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Another resident walked past, then 2 nurses. Mercer waited until they were alone. His voice came out soft, almost concerned. "You know, Hayes, I've been reviewing your performance. The incident with the Johnson family. The medication questioning. The tone with attending physicians." He shook his head slowly, like a parent disappointed in a child. "I wonder if Seattle General is really the right fit for someone so difficult. Someone who doesn't understand hierarchy." He smiled. "Perhaps you should think about whether this career is working for you." It was the knife before the blade. The signal that the next move was already in motion. That night, at 0200 hours, the major in bed 6 went into sudden distress. His monitor began to scream, a sound like alarms that had no meaning outside of one thing: death was coming. His blood pressure tanked from 118 systolic to 92, then dropped further. His chest heaved, fighting for air. Natalie was there in 2 seconds, her hands already moving on their own, muscle memory taking over before her conscious mind could catch up. She hit the code button and heard it echo through the hospital like a bird call in a canyon. This was different from the usual codes. This was someone she recognized. Someone whose eyes had widened in recognition of her just hours earlier, someone who knew what she really was. The night resident, a nervous kid named Thompson, fumbled with the ultrasound machine, his hands shaking. Dr. Mercer arrived minutes later, pulling his white coat tight, already giving orders. ACLS protocol. Start compressions. Get me an EKG and a chest X-ray. We wait for the trauma surgeon. Protocol, people. But Natalie already knew what the ultrasound would show because she could hear it in the major's breathing, could feel it in the clinical reality of what a ruptured chest wound looked like when trained hands weren't there to stop it. He had a hemothorax. Blood filling his chest cavity. His heart was being crushed by the pressure. The trauma surgeon was at least 20 minutes out, stuck somewhere in the suburbs, rolling through red lights, already too late. He's got cardiac tamponade, Natalie said, her voice steady. If we wait for the surgeon, he codes hard and doesn't come back. We need a scalpel and a rib spreader. Now. Mercer's face turned the color of old brick. You're a nurse. You stand down. We follow protocol. The major's monitor showed PEA, a pulseless electrical activity. His body was here, but electricity alone wasn't keeping him alive anymore. The next rhythm would be flat line. Natalie looked at Thompson, frozen by the ultrasound machine. She looked at the crash cart. She looked at Mercer's rigid face and understood, finally, that she had never been anyone's employee. She had only been his prisoner. With respect, doctor, she said, her voice dropping an octave, if we wait, he dies. Field thoracotomy. Clamp bleeders. Cardiac massage. He'll make it. If you touch that scalpel, you're fired, Mercer said, stepping between her and the crash cart. I will personally see your nursing license revoked. I will call administration right now and have you escorted out by security. He pulled out his phone. His fingers moved. Somewhere in the hospital, a call was going through. His network was activating in real time, safeguarding itself. The charge nurse, standing by the doorway with the crash cart, grabbed Natalie's arm. Don't do this. Please don't do this. The major's monitor flatlined. Natalie pulled her arm free. She stepped around Mercer like he wasn't there. She reached for the scalpel and picked it up, feeling the weight of it, feeling the muscle memory of 1,000 field procedures underneath her skin, beneath years of pretending to be invisible. She looked at Thompson, at the frozen resident standing in the doorway, at the entire night shift now crowding the space, phones already raised, someone already recording. If you want to learn how to save a life, she said quietly, watch closely. And then, for the first time in 8 years, she let them see her work. The monitor flatlined at 0200 hours. One moment the major's chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of recovery, his shoulder wound healing cleanly under Natalie's care. The next moment his body went rigid. The ventilator wheezed. His pressure dropped like a stone, 80/50, then 70/40, then the number spiraled into chaos. Blood pooled inside his chest cavity. The wound had held for 6 hours. 6 hours was enough time to think he'd make it. 6 hours was never enough. His crashing, the resident called out, voice climbing toward panic. Chest wound bleed. Pressure 60/35 and falling. The surgical team was 20 minutes out. 20 minutes was an eternity when someone was hemorrhaging internally. Natalie didn't hesitate. She moved to the crash cart and called for supplies with the voice of someone used to giving orders in the dark, under fire, in places where hesitation meant body bags. 14-gauge angiocath. Scalpel. Size for .0 endotracheal tube, she said. Then, rib spreader. Now. The second resident stared. We need Dr. Mercer's authorization for. Get it or step back. The tone stopped him. Something in those 3 words carried the weight of someone who had earned the right to speak without negotiation. The resident moved. The rib spreader appeared in Natalie's hands like muscle memory made metal, cold, precise, exactly what she needed. She didn't wait for the surgeon. She didn't wait for Mercer. She swabbed the Major's left anterior chest with antiseptic, her movements economical and certain, and made the incision. The scalpel went in at the fourth intercostal space, one clean horizontal cut through skin and muscle, and the smell of open body, copper and something darker, something that smelled like urgency, filled the bay. Blood welled immediately. The rib spreader went between the ribs with a soft metallic whisper, and she cranked it open. The Major's chest cavity opened like a door she had opened 1,000 times before, except she had only opened it once in her life, in Baghdad, with mortars falling and Captain Morrison bleeding out on a forward surgical table made of sandbags and desperation. This was different. This was worse. This was in front of witnesses. The two residents had moved to opposite corners of the bay, frozen like they'd been turned to stone. Through the glass, she heard the night shift gathering, nurses abandoning their charts, orderlies stopping mid-stride, everyone pulled toward the impossible thing happening in Trauma Bay 4. Someone's phone rose. Then another. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a clinical white that made the blood look obscene, arterial red against pale chest wall. Natalie saw it immediately, the intercostal artery, lacerated, bleeding into the pleural space. She could see where the wound had torn deeper than the initial assessment showed, the training accident having done more damage than the X-rays revealed. The artery was hemorrhaging steadily, methodically draining the Major's blood pressure into a space where it couldn't help him anymore. Her hands moved. Satin sky clamp. The instrument felt like coming home. She gripped the bleeder with the kind of precision that comes from having done this in the dark with nothing but a headlamp running on its last battery, with the ground shaking from incoming rounds, with a Marine bleeding faster than anyone should be able to bleed. The clamp stopped the hemorrhage. Immediate. Complete. The bleeding slowed to a seep. Saline. 2 units. Push them now, she ordered. The resident closest to the fall line moved without question. Something in her voice had shifted, the timid night shift nurse was gone. Captain Hayes, Field Surgical Unit, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, had taken her place, and the weight of that rank made the air in the trauma bay change pressure. The Major's heart had stopped generating a perfusing rhythm. Natalie could see it through the open chest, not beating, just quivering uselessly, fibrillating, a muscle trying to do work it couldn't accomplish. 30 seconds of that and brain damage began. 60 seconds and it was probably too late. She placed her hand directly on his heart. Gloved fingers against the pericardium, and she began open cardiac massage, compressing the muscle with the exact rhythm drilled into muscle memory through years and impossible situations. 30 compressions per minute. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Her fingers knew the exact pressure, enough to generate perfusion without rupturing tissue, a balance between desperation and precision that only came from practice in the worst possible places. "Come on," she said quietly. Not to the Major. To his heart. To the part of him that was fighting. The monitor showed flat line. Flat line. Flat line. Then a flutter. The rhythm returned like a light switch flipping, not perfect, not strong, but there. A beat. Another beat. Sinus rhythm emerging from chaos, the heart remembering what it was supposed to do. Natalie's hands kept moving, kept supporting, kept the gentle pressure that was keeping him alive while his own electrical system reasserted itself. Pressure 60/40, the resident called. Voice shaking. Going up. 70/45. 85/50. The surgeon burst through the doors at a sprint, white coat flaring behind him like wings. He stopped 3 feet from the trauma bay, stared into the open chest cavity, stared at Natalie's hands performing open cardiac massage with the fluid certainty of someone who had done this before, and the only words that came out were a whisper, "Who the hell are you?" Natalie didn't answer. She was already reaching for the sutures to close the lacerated artery, her hands moving from compression to repair without hesitation, muscle memory and training combining into something that looked less like nursing and more like witchcraft. The intercostal vessel closed under her precise stitching. The bleeding stopped completely. The major's pressure climbed higher, 100/60, then 105/65. Color returned to his face. His oxygen saturation hit 94% and held steady. She stepped back. The surgeon moved in. Natalie peeled off her gloves and looked at the two residents still standing in their corners, still frozen, still holding that moment in their eyes like they'd been shown something they weren't supposed to see. Through the glass, the phones were still recording. The night shift had seen everything. Every incision. Every moment her hands had moved with the certainty of someone performing this in the dark under mortar fire. Every moment the invisible night shift nurse had become someone else entirely. The footage was already being texted. Already being sent to group chats. Already spreading through Seattle General like an infection no antibiotic could touch. Dr. Mercer arrived at 0247 hours, pulling on his coat, face already darkening with the kind of rage that comes from seeing an opportunity crystallize. He took in the scene, the major stable, intubated, recovering, his life saved by someone who shouldn't have been able to save him. Shouldn't have been licensed for it. Shouldn't have been able to perform a thoracotomy without a physician present. Shouldn't have been able to do anything except distribute medications and empty bedpans according to the scope of practice clearly defined in hospital policy. He saw what she'd done. He understood immediately what it meant. And he started making phone calls before the major's second chest tube had even been placed. The surgeon looked at Natalie as she washed her hands, the blood swirling copper red down the sink, and said quietly, "That was. I've trained surgeons for 30 years. I've never seen hands move like that in an emergency." He paused. "You're going to have a hard time explaining this to administration." Natalie didn't answer. She knew what was coming. She'd known the moment she picked up that scalpel. She had just saved a major's life, and in doing so, she had exposed something that was supposed to stay buried. The choice had been simple: watch him die, or break every rule that mattered to people who didn't understand that rules were written for normal circumstances, and nothing about her life had ever been normal. She dried her hands. The folded flag was still in her locker, pressed against the back corner where no one would find it, where its presence wouldn't raise questions. For 8 years she had kept that secret, a small triangle of fabric from a funeral that was never supposed to happen, a reminder of someone who died in her arms in a place that no longer officially existed. She'd added a new secret tonight. One that had been filmed by a dozen phones. The night shift parted as she walked past them toward the break room, their eyes following her, their phones still glowing with the evidence of who she really was. No one spoke. No one asked questions. They had all just watched Natalie Hayes go to work, and she had left no doubt about which world she came from. By 0400 hours, Dr. Mercer had the state medical board complaint filed. By 0600, he had the hospital board president on the phone. By 0800, he would have security waiting with a box for her locker and a check for the severance package that came with immediate termination. But for now, in the small hours before dawn, Natalie sat in the break room with a cup of cold coffee and waited for the day's shift to arrive. Waited for the machinery of consequences to begin turning. Waited for the moment when everything she had built, her careful invisibility, her quiet life, her secret identity as just another night shift nurse, would come apart completely. The surgical team would report what they'd witnessed to administration. The patients on the floor would talk. The footage would circulate. Questions would be asked about her credentials, her background, her qualifications to perform emergency thoracotomy on a patient without surgical training. She had saved his life. And in doing so, she had ended her own. By noon, the entire hospital knew what she'd done. The footage had spread through the night shift like contagion, phone cameras capturing the moment Natalie cracked the major's chest in the ER bay, hands moving with the kind of certainty that belonged in a trauma center, not in a nurse's scope. By 6 a.m., it was on Reddit. By 8 a.m., a local news station had posted it with the headline, "Is this nurse actually a surgeon?" The comments section exploded. Medical students arguing procedure. Nurses defending her. People asking questions that should have stayed buried. Dr. Mercer watched the views climb from his office, 14,000 by breakfast, 47,000 by the time he finished his coffee. He wasn't angry yet. He was calculating. The unauthorized procedure was a gift wrapped in legal liability. A career-ending mistake made public. He picked up his office phone at 8:51 a.m., while the hospital board president was between holes at Longview Country Club. "Good morning, Richard. It's Dr. Mercer from Seattle General." His voice carried the warmth of old money discussing old problems. "I'm calling about a liability issue that requires immediate board attention. We have a nurse on staff who performed unauthorized surgical procedures last night without physician supervision. There's video documentation. The state medical board needs to be notified within 24 hours, and I've already flagged this with our risk management team." The board president's voice crackled back, still holding the casual tone of someone who didn't yet understand the weight of what he was hearing. "Unauthorized? How is that possible? The situation is complicated." The nurse in question, Natalie Hayes, Level 2 ICU, appears to have received military medical training at some point. She performed what can only be described as combat surgery in our emergency bay. The patient was coding, yes, but protocol exists for a reason. If he'd arrested again, if her procedure had caused additional damage, we're looking at potential wrongful death litigation, JCAHO violations, CMS sanctions. By 11 a.m., Mercer had contacted the state medical board's complaint hotline and filed a formal report, unauthorized practice of medicine, gross violation of scope of practice, endangerment of patients. By 11:30, he'd called a risk management consultant named Patterson who owed him a favor from a previous case, a consultant whose hourly rate exceeded a nurse's monthly salary and whose conclusions could be written in advance. Patterson arrived at the hospital carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Natalie's car, nodded at Mercer's summary, and began the official investigation with the predetermined gravity of a man being paid to find exactly what his employer wanted found. By 11:45, Natalie was still in the hospital. Still working. Still unaware that the machinery of institutional destruction had already been set in motion. The call came over the intercom at 12:02 p.m. Natalie Hayes to security. Natalie Hayes to security. She knew before she moved. Nurses could read the tone of an intercom call the way soldiers read wind. This wasn't a supply issue. This wasn't a patient question. She set down her tablet, removed her gloves, and walked toward the elevator with the same measured pace she used to cross minefields, nothing in her face, nothing in her shoulders, just forward motion. Security was waiting in the main lobby. 2 guards, both looking uncomfortable, both holding a cardboard box that contained 8 years of her life, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, 3 paperback novels from night shifts, a photo of Emma in a frame, a stethoscope with her initials scratched into the chest piece. Natalie Hayes? The senior guard, Davis, had always been decent to her. He wouldn't meet her eyes now. "I'm here. You're being terminated effective immediately. Dr. Mercer and hospital administration have authorized immediate removal from the premises pending a full investigation into violations of your scope of practice." Davis handed her a manila envelope. The papers inside were already signed. "Your access badge has been revoked." She looked at the envelope without opening it. "What's the allegation?" "Emergency thoracotomy performed without physician authorization. Practicing medicine without a license. Patient endangerment." Davis's voice had the hollow quality of a man reading words that someone else had written. "You'll need to surrender your badge now." Natalie reached for her badge, the laminated card that had gotten her through every door at Seattle General for 8 years, and handed it to Davis. He took a pair of scissors from the security desk, actual scissors, the kind used to cut ribbon at hospital ribbon cuttings, and cut the badge in half with 2 deliberate snaps. The sound traveled across the lobby. 2 nurses at the front desk turned to watch. A patient's family member paused mid-conversation. The day shift knew. Everyone would know within the hour. She took the cardboard box. It weighed almost nothing. "Dr. Mercer wanted you to know that he'll be releasing a statement to staff," Davis continued, still not meeting her eyes. "It will say that you're being terminated for gross violation of scope of practice, unauthorized surgical procedure, and insubordination. He's also stating that patient safety is the hospital's highest priority and that measures have been taken to ensure this situation doesn't happen again. The words landed like shrapnel. Not accurate. Not fair. Simply effective. She stood there absorbing them with one measured breath, her jaw clenching for exactly 1 second before she could smooth her face back into neutral. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not explain. The trembling in her chest wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from having held a dying man's heart in your hands and knowing that your words didn't matter anymore. "I'll need to collect my locker contents," she said quietly. "That's already been packed." Davis gestured to the box. "Everything from your locker is in there." She looked down at the cardboard. Everything. 8 years reduced to a box that a security guard could carry with one hand. By 12:17 p.m., she was driving. The box sat on the passenger seat, and she kept her eyes on the road with a kind of focus that kept soldiers alive on patrol routes where IEDs waited in trash piles. The city moved around her, traffic lights, pedestrians, delivery trucks, and none of it touched her. She drove in silence all the way home, parked in the driveway, and sat in the car for 20 minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, staring at the garage door as if it might provide instructions. The house smelled like her daughter's morning cereal. Emma wouldn't be home from school for another 45 minutes. Natalie carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen counter. She opened it carefully, as if whatever was inside might detonate. The chipped coffee mug. The paperback novels. The photo of Emma. And wrapped in a surgical mask that she'd kept specifically for this purpose, the folded flag from Lieutenant James Carey, 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company, 75th Ranger Regiment. The only thing she'd kept from Baghdad. The only thing that mattered. She pulled out the flag and pressed it against her chest. The fabric was soft from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. She'd kept it hidden because flags could be questions, and questions led to answers that nobody was supposed to find. She'd kept it secret the way she kept everything secret, compartmentalized, controlled, contained. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and let herself break in a way that only happened in empty houses. She didn't hear her daughter come home at 3:31 p.m. Emma's key turning in the lock, her backpack hitting the floor with the familiar thud of a kid who'd just survived another day of 3rd-grade mathematics. Emma's sneakers on the tile floor, moving toward the kitchen with the unconcerned confidence of a child who expected nothing unusual. Emma stopped in the doorway. Saw her mother at the kitchen table. Saw the tears streaming down Natalie's face, tears that her mother had never allowed before, tears that belonged to someone other than the woman Emma knew. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma's voice was small and confused, the voice of a child whose world had just tilted on its axis. "Did something bad happen?" Natalie couldn't answer. She pulled her daughter close and held her, and she didn't explain that she had saved a man's life and lost everything in the same moment. She didn't explain that the universe kept score in ways that the scoreboard never showed. She just held Emma and breathed and felt the weight of the flag still pressed against her chest, against her heart, against the part of her that had never left Baghdad. By 4 p.m., the Major woke up in the ICU with a breathing tube in his throat and no memory of the last 16 hours. Recovery nurse Martinez was checking his vitals when he tried to speak, a small wheeze of air that became almost a word. "Easy," Martinez said, adjusting his oxygen. "Don't try to talk. You coded last night. You're in post-op recovery. Do you understand?" The Major's eyes focused. He managed a nod. His hand moved toward the call button, but Martinez intercepted. "What do you need?" The Major pulled the oxygen mask down an inch and tried again. "The nurse." "Phantom." "Where?" "I don't know what you mean, Major." "Let me get your physician." The Major let his head fall back against the pillow, and something shifted in his expression, recognition replaced by something darker. He reached for his phone on the bedside table. His fingers were still shaking from surgery, but they were steady enough to dial. The phone rang at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the office of a colonel he'd served with in Fallujah. The colonel answered on the second ring. Sir, I need you to make a call. To Seattle General. There's a nurse named Natalie Hayes, captain level, combat medic from Baghdad. She saved my life last night. Someone here is trying to destroy her. The colonel listened. The colonel understood immediately. The colonel made his own call. And somewhere in a Pentagon office, in a filing system that was supposed to stay locked forever, a classified flag began to move. The mandatory background check for the malpractice investigation was supposed to be routine. Standard hospital protocol. The risk management department had initiated it the morning after the thoracotomy, searching for licensing violations, credential gaps, anything that would justify what Natalie had done without authorization. What they found instead was a wall of black ink. Redaction upon redaction. Classified. Top secret. Special access program. The hospital's legal team contacted the state medical board. The state medical board contacted federal authorities. And federal authorities contacted someone much higher up the chain. Within 6 hours, 2 Pentagon officials in pressed dress uniforms arrived at Seattle General with a file so heavily redacted it looked like someone had taken a marker to every other paragraph. They moved through the hospital with the quiet authority of people accustomed to opening locked doors without asking. Security escorted them directly to the major's room on the 4th floor. He was sitting up now, breathing on his own, color returning to his face like someone waking from a long sleep. When he saw them, his body went rigid. Not from pain. From recognition. One of the officials opened the file. The major stared at Natalie through the doorway, where she'd frozen mid-step while delivering evening vitals. His lips moved without sound at first. Then, barely audible, phantom. The word hung in the sterile air like a prayer. Natalie's hand stilled. The blood pressure cuff dangled from her fingers. No one had called her that in 14 years. Not since Baghdad. Not since the operation that was supposed to erase her from every database, every record, every official memory of what happened in that forward surgical tent when mortars fell and men screamed and she'd held a severed subclavian artery together with trembling fingers and sheer will. A Marine Corps colonel stepped into the room. He was built like a fortification, shoulders that seemed to occupy their own space, jaw set with the kind of permanent resolve that came from seeing things that couldn't be unseen. He opened the file again and began to read, his voice measured and precise as a courtroom record. Captain Natalie Marie Hayes. Bronze Star with Valor for leadership under fire. He paused. Natalie felt the room contract around her. Purple Heart. 2 of them. For wounds sustained in combat operations. Another pause. Someone's phone buzzed in a pocket. No one moved. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action. Citation, performed 17 life-saving surgical procedures under sustained enemy fire in Fallujah, Jolon District, February through April, 2009. Operations included emergency thoracotomy, subclavian vessel repair, emergency cricothyrotomy, and open abdominal exploration without anesthesia in 9 separate cases. All patients survived transport to higher levels of care. Operation classified as JSOC Task Force Initiative. Captain Hayes was declared KIA on April 14, 2009, to protect the security of the operation. Said operation resulted in the rescue of 217 personnel. The colonel closed the file. 217 lives, Captain. Because you tried to save everyone. Because you did save everyone. Dr. Mercer pushed into the crowded room, his face already mottled with the flush of someone about to assert dominance. Excuse me, these are unauthorized personnel. This is an active patient, hospital protocols require. A 2-star general stepped forward. The man was silver-haired, with decorations on his chest that told stories of wars spanning 3 decades. He raised his hand, and Mercer's voice died in his throat like an engine cutting out mid-roar. The general's eyes found Natalie's across the room. He saluted. A full, formal, dress uniform salute to her invisible medals. Captain. His voice was a blade being drawn. The fraud investigation you initiated has been exceptionally thorough. The FBI has compiled 14,000 pages of evidence documenting your systematic Medicare fraud, kickback schemes with medical supply vendors, and the systematic covering of prior malpractice incidents. All of this was discovered because you demanded we investigate Captain Hayes' background. You weaponized federal resources against a war hero to protect your financial arrangements. Every single piece of evidence was in plain sight. You just never thought anyone would look. Mercer's face went the color of spoiled milk. The general didn't blink. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation. Your hospital privileges are revoked effective immediately. The FBI will be executing a warrant on your home and office within the hour. Your attorney should tell you that cooperation with the investigation will be noted during sentencing. Mercer tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled onto dry land. He looked around the room, at the colonel, at the general, at the major, at Natalie standing with the blood pressure cuff still in her hands, and something in him seemed to collapse inward. His shoulders sagged. His eyes went flat. He turned and walked out of the room like a man walking toward an execution. The general turned to Natalie. His smile was not unkind. "Welcome back, Captain. It's been a long time." 6 weeks later, Natalie sat in her new office as Director of Emergency Medicine at Seattle General. The nameplate on her door read Captain Natalie Hayes, MD, Director. She'd finally allowed them to add the captain. The rank had been her through all the redacted years, invisible in her bones even when her name was erased from every file. Now the truth lived in plain sight. From her window on the 3rd floor, she watched the parking lot below. A cluster of teenagers gathered around a dummy on a metal table. CPR training. Community college class. She recognized the instructor immediately. Dr. Mercer. Except he wasn't a doctor anymore. The man wore a cheap polo shirt with a community college logo embroidered on the chest, the kind of uniform you could buy at a discount store. His monogrammed white coat was gone. His Rolex was gone, seized during the asset freeze. His house was in foreclosure. His wife had filed for divorce the day the reporters started camping outside their home asking questions about 14,000 pages of FBI evidence. He was demonstrating chest compressions on a dummy with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, but the spark was gone. The authority was gone. He looked diminished, like someone had adjusted the resolution on his existence downward. A teenager in the back row scrolled through her phone while he talked. He didn't correct her. Natalie didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't feel the surge of victory she might have expected. Instead, she took one measured breath and returned to her work, the billing oversight protocols she'd designed, the ethics training module she'd created, the systems that would make it impossible for any physician to weaponize their authority the way Mercer had. The systems that would ensure no other nurse, no other person who challenged corruption, would be silenced by someone powerful enough to erase them. The folded flag sat in her desk drawer. The flag from Baghdad. From the team that didn't make it home. She'd kept it hidden for 14 years, pressed against her chest in her jacket like a talisman, like evidence of her own mortality. Now it lived in her office, visible when she opened the drawer for files. Emma had seen it yesterday when she visited, her daughter walking into the office and seeing her mother's name on the door, seeing the decorations beginning to appear on the walls, seeing the folded flag. "You're important here," Emma had said. 8 years old and certain of something her mother had been unable to believe for herself. The major appeared in her doorway at 3 o'clock. He was moving without assistance now, his shoulder healing clean, his scar tissue forming the kind of neat lines that spoke to good surgery, to hands that knew exactly where the knife needed to go. They shared coffee in comfortable silence, two people who'd survived different kinds of battles, who understood without speaking what it meant to carry secrets in your body, to move through the world knowing what you were capable of, knowing what you'd lost. "I watched you in the tent," he said after a long while. "In Baghdad. Mortar rounds coming down like rain. You were operating on Morrison with a combat knife and a field kit. Your hands didn't shake. Not once. I thought you were the bravest thing I'd ever seen." Natalie looked at her hands. They were steady now. They'd always been steady when it mattered. She touched the scar on her collarbone, old shrapnel wound from a round that should have killed her, and remembered the smoke, the screaming, the blood that wouldn't stop running no matter how many tourniquets she applied. "I tried to save everyone," she said quietly. "But you did save everyone." The Major leaned back in his chair. "You saved me twice. Once in the dark with a knife, and once in the ER bay in front of 200 witnesses. Some people live their whole lives and never get one chance to make a difference. You've had two. And you've earned both." The charge nurse appeared at her door, the same nurse who'd grabbed her arm that night when Mercer ordered her not to operate. The same nurse who'd almost chosen loyalty to a corrupt administrator over loyalty to her profession. She was nervous now, respectful, the way people became when they realized they'd been standing next to someone they'd misjudged. "Director Hayes," she said carefully. "Trauma coming in. Multiple GSWs, ETA 5 minutes. Natalie stood. She touched the compass necklace Emma had given her, "So you'll always find your way home," and headed toward the ER. The Major followed her to the door, watching as she moved through the corridors with the same quiet efficiency that had once kept men alive under mortar fire. The elevator doors opened. The waiting area went silent. Nurses fell into step beside her. The same nurses who'd scattered from the break room like she carried something contagious now moved toward her like she was a lighthouse in a storm. On the ER board, her name appeared, Director Hayes, Trauma Arrival. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. And Natalie Hayes, Captain, Navy Cross recipient, callsign Phantom, had seen the worst and survived it. Now she'd give everything. If you found yourself rooting for Natalie, wondering if you've ever misjudged someone based on their uniform or their title, please like this video and subscribe. We'll have more stories of hidden strength and earned respect coming your way. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been completely wrong about someone? Share your story. We're listening.